Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today our guest, Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani, who is visiting from Kwantlen Polytechnic University. For those of you who don't know, that is located in British Columbia, and you can tell that Rajiv is from BC because he thinks today is a really cold day. He was shivering on the way to lunch. I met Rajiv at a conference I go to each summer that's devoted to psychology, introductory psychology instructors, and we've had many wonderful conversations. And he's sort of on this whirlwind tour. He was at Waterloo yesterday. He came in this morning to lead a discussion in our journal club group. He's giving this talk today, and then tomorrow he has a talk at Sheridan and then at Ryerson University. So it's quite the whirlwind. Just a little bit background about Rajiv. A couple of current roles. He's the OER Research Fellow, Open Education Group. He's the Associate Editor for Psychology, Learning and Teaching. And among his recent awards is the Robert E. Knox Master Teacher Award, UBC, the Robert Siegel Award, International Society of Political Psychology. And Rajiv is very much active in scholarship of teaching and learning, and a couple of recent books that he's been involved with, A Compendium of Scales for Use in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, published in 2015, and Open, the Philosophy and Practices that are Revolutionizing Psychological Science and Education. I'm really looking forward to hearing Rajiv's talk about the future is open, enhancing pedagogy via open educational practices. Please join me in welcoming Rajiv.
So, I'm really very happy to be here, especially because Joe is one of these people I really look up to within our discipline. He's easily regarded as one of the more innovative practitioners when it comes to teaching introductory psychology. And so again, you think about the culture of the institution that spawns that kind of innovation or encourages that kind of innovation. And so that's part of the reason why I was so happy to be here. So I'm going to try and talk about not just open educational resources, which is something that some of you may already be familiar with, but the more broader open educational practices and how these might easily be harnessed to serve our students, your faculty, but also the institution altogether. But before I talk about any of these details, I wanted to start with some common ground. So whether you're faculty or whether you work with faculty or indeed with students every day, I wanted you to see if you could recognize the following situation. Let me paint a picture for you. It's a dark night. A student visits a faculty member's office. And so it goes. Does that look familiar to anybody in this room? Of course, there's good arguments. It's interesting to talk about the ethics of it, isn't it? A system, or I should back up. I think in many ways, this is a good starting point because this is what higher education is meant to achieve, and not many of us recognize that the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights has language embedded within it concerning the importance of accessibility of higher education. Yet, much of the time that I can see, the very system, higher ed, that's meant to be a vehicle to help deliver people from social inequality is structured in a way that actually only reinforces it. And so this is part of the impetus for where I'm coming from. Of course, you all recognize this. Over the last several decades, there's been a systematic reduction in the amount of government support of higher education. This is not a surprise to anybody in this room, I imagine. But we're at a point where the decrease in government funding and support is matched by the increase in the burden that's carried by our students. In Ontario in particular at this moment, students pay more than 50% of the burden of higher education. And this comes principally in the forms of tuition, but also other fees, ancillary fees and other costs, including, of course, the cost of course materials. Now, even if we work with students every day, I don't think we often recognize how widespread this issue is and how painful this impact is. We may not recognize, for example, that fully 50%, you've seen the movie, fully 50% of our students across the country require a student loan simply to come to the classroom. That's a starting point. And when we're talking about the entire student loan debt, I updated that in terms on Sunday or on Monday morning. So that's very current. 6 years ago, student loan debt, federal student loan debt, exceeded $15 billion. The federal government at that point had to raise the debt ceiling to $19 billion, and that's forecast to be breached in the year 2020. Those are current numbers. And that's just federal student loan debt, not provincial and not private. Average student loan debt in this country, about $29,000. And about 3 years after having graduated, barely a third of our students have managed to free themselves from the shackles of this debt. It's a serious social justice issue with a human face. And I love this picture because a few years ago, UBC, my alma mater, had a campaign that they used to celebrate their graduates, and they put out these posters across the ground of the campus, and they gave the students these markers and encouraged them to fill out what was most meaningful or memorable for them. And as you can see, this one was filled out by an uncomfortably honest student. I will always remember UBC for my crippling debt. Ontario students, and indeed students across the country, are working a lot more nowadays, and if you're an instructor, this is not a surprise to you. We see more of our students working not just part-time, but even trying to hold down full-time work while attempting to go to school full-time. This is happening increasingly. There are mental health consequences to this, but there are financial implications as well, when students are asked to choose between groceries and course materials, for example. So it's no longer the case that students can take a summer job and pay for their education. We know that when student loans go from $1,000 to $10,000, program completion rates plummet from 59% to 8%. And this is where institutions and administrators start to get really interested in the implications for the institution of this inaccessible requirement. Now, of course, there's many things that are behind these increase in costs, and tuition is obviously the biggest part of that. There's cost of living. Certainly in BC, it's extraordinary how quickly the cost of living has risen and how unaffordable, for example, accommodation has become. But I don't think any of us in this room individually control tuition or cost of living. But one factor that I think many of us do have control over is the cost of course materials. And so this is one entry point into this conversation. Few of us realize that over the last 30, 40 years or so, the cost of textbooks has risen more than 1,000%. The other line you're seeing over here is inflation. So more than 3 times the pace of inflation. And this includes 82% over the last decade. So again, against the backdrop of all of these things, this is one aspect that I think we have much more control over, much more control than we admit anyway. I am not proud to say that we now live in the era of the $400 textbook, right? And this is not an isolated example. Now, if you look on social media, for example, you'll notice that students across the country, student unions and broader groups of students have started to organize and mobilize themselves with social media campaigns. And there's a hashtag, which is textbook broke. And if you search for that, you'll see students across this nation coming out of bookstores at the beginning of every semester, taking pictures, photographs of their receipts, the amount that they've spent on books that morning, and they're tweeting these. And this is going viral. This is a massive campaign. Students trying to demonstrate to instructors and administrators the impact of this. This is a whiteboard that a particular student union put outside their bookstore, and as students came out, of course, they just checked off how much they spent, from less than $100 to more than $1,000. You'll see several students at the top simply wrote in too much on their own stead and fill that in. And my personal favorite right at the bottom, how much did you spend? It says over here, my firstborn. So again, this is a serious issue. And it's especially a serious issue when you realize that this has a very, very personal impact. It is not an accident that students across this country, and including in Ontario, are using food banks at universities in record numbers. Last year, UBC experienced a 100% increase in the use of its food bank from the previous year by its students. This is not an accident, and it's quite widespread. And then, of course, we talk about classroom instruction, putting together syllabi, and describing particular course textbooks as required. We all know students are bright and they're creative and certainly they're motivated. And there's a number of ways in which they find to get around these required course materials, at least without having to spend these $400 or $200 each on textbooks. So these are options that you're probably familiar with for the most part. Whenever possible, they buy used copies of the textbooks. If possible, if the edition hasn't changed just that summer before, for example, and the old edition is no longer really workable for them, they buy online, places like Amazon. Students are spending less and less money at university bookstores because this is unaffordable. So they're trying to find every creative way around it. And bookstores are no longer the cash cow that they used to be as students seek to find other ways to get their resources. They resell the resources if they can, if the edition hasn't changed midway through the semester, rendering those resources or the $200 textbook worth about $10 by the end. They rent, of course, there's many rental programs. They often buy in groups as shared purchases in a class where they obviously need it all at the same time ahead of the exams and assessments. They use library loans, course reserves, interlibrary loans, often back to back to back from multiple institutions. It's amazing the lengths that students are going to nowadays. Photocopying, of course, and more students are realizing that they can buy the international edition of the textbook, which is more or less, but not exactly the same content, at a fraction of the cost. And despite the fact that we keep warning them that they're responsible for the mismatch in content if they choose to go for a previous edition, they often go for that. It's a calculated choice that they make. And in some cases, I mean, you can't argue with this logic, can you, when it comes to this? It's a fair point in some sense. But I think we're all familiar with the traditional practice of the publishers. Once a textbook has been out for a year or so, it's the used book market that saturates the market, and they're no longer making any money from that. And I think we're all familiar with the practice of cosmetic updates with new editions, which hamstring students. So let's talk about professors and faculty and how we can help or how we can hurt. Here's one way in which we hurt. And I think there's few things that are more frustrating for a student than spending $200 on a textbook and then realizing 3 months into the semester that you only really needed a couple of chapters from it. And that's another pattern we're seeing at bookstores across the country, where students are waiting several weeks into the semester. 4 weeks into the semester, you're probably going to see lines of 20, 30 students at the cashier, because that's when they decide, okay, now I know I actually do need the textbook. And they're willing to wait, which is often why you see that opening month of the semester having poor performance and students not having their course resources. So these are all serious issues. They also go to a particularly dark corner of the internet that we all know as ratemyprofessor.com. And they actually sift through the reviews of faculty to see if there's multiple sections for a particular course, which instructor is actually using the book, which instructor is not using the book as much. I didn't make this up, by the way. This is an actual profile that exists on Rate My Prof for Master Yoda, which I think is magnificent. Master Yoda, of course, some of you are more familiar with Princess Leia in the psychology department, but it's very helpful, Master Yoda, but not very clear. I think that's fair. Mm-hmm. And worse than this, they're illegally downloading the books in increasing numbers. This is a representative case. I'm going to read this. This is a message posted by the student who scanned and uploaded this textbook from Pearson in this particular case. It says, Penn State, you are gouging your students. We'd be willing to pay a fair price for this book, but that would be far south of the $200 you charge at the bookstore. Fix this, lower the tuition, and maybe students like me won't spend several days scanning your materials and putting it online. Also, I love this, clean the bathrooms on the first floor of Willard. It's just a catch-all for all of their complaints about the university. It's fantastic. But again, I mean, think about the structure of the system. If we're setting it up in a way such that so many of our students take this illegal downloading and uploading, in fact, as the preferable option for them. It's a strange environment. And it's not just this. This is a big social justice plea, of course, but we should also think about pedagogy, because we do know that there's a tangible and direct relationship. These are data from a large representative survey in the United States, but we've seen similar data that we've just finished collecting in British Columbia as well. And that's just for one of their courses. But 35% take fewer courses because of these costs, and 23% routinely go without course materials. Right? Now, in many ways, I'm setting this up to suggest that faculty have control, and as people who work with students and faculty, we have a role to play in encouraging the shift away from high-priced, overpriced course materials. But as a faculty member myself, this is kind of what I see when I look in the mirror. Right? This is my daily life. This is me trying to stay abreast of recent developments in my discipline. This is me keeping up with all of my teaching obligations. This is me doing service on a variety of committees within the university, service outside of the university, editorial work, and God forbid, before I collapse in an exhausted pile at the end of the day, spend a little bit of time with my family, right? This is me. And then as this happens, you get these wonderful, cheerful, smiling faces that knock on your office door every couple of weeks, unsolicited, of course. And these are the textbook publisher reps. And they say, don't worry, we've got you covered. We have a wonderful plug and play, ready to go resource. It's a textbook, so you don't have to worry about that. It comes with a set of, a large test bank, so you don't have to spend any time writing questions. It comes with a set of PowerPoint files, which if you've ever looked at publisher PowerPoint files, they're quite atrocious. But anyway, this is sold as a good thing. And we've got automated online adaptive quizzing, so really you don't even have to worry about formative assessment. And of course, many of these claims are quite baseless in terms of their alleged pedagogical value. But few people ask the question, which faculty member turns to a publisher rep and says, can you show me any efficacy studies for this new technology? Few of us, excuse me, few of us do that. And I think part of what we're dealing with over here is what's called a principal-agent dilemma. This is when an individual makes a decision that governs a large group of people, that the larger group are bound by, but that the individual making the decision never faces the consequence of. This is a textbook case, actually, of a principal-agent dilemma, if you will. And I would suggest that a good symptom that this is at play is if the faculty member doesn't actually know the precise cost of the textbook that they've assigned. It's probably a good sense of this. And of course, if you do have these conversations with the smiling, cheerful publisher representatives and you explain that you're concerned about the cost to students, they'll start to talk about hardcover options and softcover options and loose leaf binder versions and e-books, right? As if this is a wonderful demonstration of their caring. And I'm going to suggest this is a good example. This is a cognitive psychology text that I used to assign many moons ago. Today it costs $190 plus tax, of course. Or of course you can get the e-book at the low cost of $102. It's wonderful. But I'm also going to suggest that this is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Right? It comes with a license that expires after a certain number of months, 6 months, 8 months. So if a student wants to retake the class, whether they failed it or they just want to improve their grade, they have to buy it again. If they're interested in lifelong learning, God forbid, they no longer have access to it. It's also locked within a proprietary platform that's incompatible in most cases with assistive learning technologies. So at the start, I talked about the importance of affordability. And yes, I think we have to think about if higher education is unaffordable, who are we saying belongs in higher ed? We also have to think about if higher education is inaccessible in terms of assistive learning technologies, who are we saying belongs in higher ed? And of course, the sad reality is that students who take the ebook option, in some cases, end up spending more money than students who buy a print copy and are able to resell that at the end of the semester. So as I say, this is not particularly innovation, and that's without talking about all of the interesting practices between publisher reps and departments, and all of these wonderful deals that are signed, right? Can we, for example, incentivize the adoption of a textbook for the next 3-year cycle within your department? Today's the New Hampshire primary, so that's perhaps why Republican gatherings are on my mind. But of course it goes more than this. I've been at departments where the department itself will receive a $2 or $3 kickback per textbook that's sold within their department for the 3-year adoption cycle. Right? Is there a conference? Is there a meeting we could potentially support? Is there a student research symposium that we could sponsor, they'll say, right? Or better yet, we'll set up a scholarship for your students in exchange for this adoption, which is really the equivalent of affixing 1,000 leeches on the student body and then using a small fraction of that blood to donate to one of the victims. It's really quite insidious when it's set up and framed in a way that's beneficial to students, these incentives. But I suspect that if students truly knew about some of these deals that are being struck between departments and publishers, I suspect we would see a lot more cars burning in the parking lot. So again, I'm going to suggest there's a much better way forward. It's not the only way forward, but it's one that I'm quite happy to champion. Take a look. that video was obviously produced by OpenStax College, which is one of many, many providers of open textbooks, which is one form of open educational resources. As you can see, they're based at Rice University, and I should say that I have zero affiliation with OpenStax. I just really like that video. But what I'm talking about are open educational resources more broadly. And these can be a range of things, anything that you use for teaching and learning as a resource. But they include, of course, open textbooks themselves. One common misconception is that open textbooks are free textbooks, because they're more than free. They are free. But open textbooks are free with permissions, and it's the permissions that are the really important distinguishing feature. So yes, open textbooks are free to students in a range of digital formats that they can use on virtually any device that they have, a tablet, a laptop, a cell phone, or whatever. But they're with permissions. And those permissions are typically referred to as the 5 R's. The one in the middle is the most obvious one. You get to reuse these resources without asking anybody's permission. You have the permission to use them. You can retain them forever. Sure, you can redistribute them to your students, or in fact your students can redistribute them further to their colleagues, their friends, their communities, their family, no problem. But as an instructor, these are the exciting permissions, the ability to revise, remix, adapt, contextualize the resources to suit your particular context. So really, in many ways, when I look at open educational resources, for students I absolutely think about the social justice argument and the absolutely important value these cost savings have for them. But for instructors, it's literally like a new layer of academic freedom. When we think about how many instructors, not just here, but anywhere really, how many of us typically bend our courses to map onto the structure of a traditional textbook, when in fact we ought to be modifying our instructional materials to suit our pedagogical goals. Small things that we do every day. So open educational resources is typically anything that has a Creative Commons license, and there's more than 1 billion such things. An example would be, let's say if you're teaching art history. And art history is an important case because those textbooks tend to be the most prohibitively expensive because of the copyright costs involved, the royalties. But the Rijksmuseum in the Netherlands is a stunning case of where they've put online extremely high resolution, as in you can print a picture the size of this wall, but without paying a cent for the actual image. They've released these to the commons, to the public, for free. It's wonderful. So you could rely on these resources. If you're working in English literature, you could go to Project Gutenberg, where they've digitized thousands of classics of English literature and are available for free for bookstores and print shops to print and supply to their students without having to pay any exorbitant fees. There's no reason for it anymore. Or you could go to places, if you're teaching survey introductory courses, to places like OpenStax College. OpenStax is supported by the Hewlett Foundation, and their goal is to provide textbooks for the most popular large-scale adoption courses, as you can see some of the ones over here. And they're interesting in that they provide a number of ancillary resources to go with their textbooks, things like test banks and PowerPoint slides. And then when it comes to online platforms, they actually partner, including with publishers, for instructors who want to keep the adaptive platform but don't want their students to spend $200 to get access to it. OpenStax is a good example as well of the widespread adoption of OER. It's amazing. 1 out of every 5 degree-granting institutions today in the United States has an OpenStax textbook adopted by one of its courses. That's really, really widespread adoption. And in Canada, of course, it's growing more and more, because in BC, we've been leading with an initiative, I'm going to skip past this one, called the BC Open Textbook Project. 3 years ago, the Ministry of Advanced Education provided $1 million to build or otherwise revise and update textbooks that would be for the 40 highest enrolled undergraduate courses in BC, which are really not that different from the ones in Ontario, for that matter. It's typically, you're thinking, the first 2 years of classes, survey classes, yes, obviously introductory psychology is in that mix, which is why I really got involved in this. And at this point, the repository in BC has something like 140 textbooks available for a lot of traditional academic areas, with an additional 30 or so for trades and technology areas. And many of them have been revised and contextualized. So we have Canadian editions of introductory psychology books in here. We have Canadian pre-Confederation history, which has been written by a colleague of mine, John Belshaw. He's from Thompson Rivers University in BC. And one of the things I love that he did with this is he took advantage of the digital nature of the platform. That yes, students can download the digital files in any format for free, but if they access it online, also for free, they get to interact with a bunch of multimedia. So they went and did video interviews with leading experts, leading historians in subtopic areas of history, and they've embedded those video interviews in the middle of the book. In other books, we see interactive simulations and data visualization embedded within the books. So again, bringing to life the nature of the resource itself. You can have the print copy, absolutely, but you can do a lot more. Now, of course, this is a review, so faculty reviews are solicited using a rather detailed rubric, which is a bit washed out over here. But these reviews are posted openly, so when you're adopting it, you get a sense of what your colleagues think are this book's strengths and weaknesses. And I'm a bit biased over here, I'll happily disclose, because I have co-authored 2 of the open textbooks in this repository. This one is for Research Methods in Psychology, which is now in its 2nd edition. And this is what the front page looks like. You can download it in a variety of formats, again, completely for free. And I'm very happy to say that I don't feel any conflict of interest over here, because I will never, ever in my lifetime receive a single cent as royalty for this book. It is free. The license has been provided. And for students, well, like me, who would prefer a print copy of the book, Simon Fraser University in BC has pioneered this, where they have this print-on-demand service, and they actually print these books at cost for students throughout BC. So a 600-page social psychology textbook actually costs students $15, 1-5, plus shipping, you would think. But then we took advantage of the interlibrary loan shuttle that moves between our institutions every week, and now we deliver those with that shuttle for free to the campus of the student. It's all happening. My institution has now surpassed 100 course adoptions with open textbooks. And with our tiny, tiny small class sizes, which are capped at 35 students, even at that size, we've already saved students $250,000 in the last little while. So this is leadership in BC, but overall, open textbooks worldwide have saved students about $174 million. It's extraordinary, the amount of funding that the Gates Foundation, that the Hewlett Foundation, and that governments, whether it's in Texas or in British Columbia, are putting behind this. Over the last year, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba's provincial governments have signed memoranda of understanding with BC to also share in the development costs and sharing on dissemination of open textbooks in their repositories. So it's a movement that started out west, but it's now very much happening in Ontario as well. And schools like Carleton and even Waterloo are looking very seriously at this as well. So I'm going to take a step back for a moment, because so far it sounds, wonderful. But the question is always going to be asked, rightly so, and you can probably say this with me, if it's free, how good can it be, right? You hear that voice in the back of your head. You think about the value that's added by publishers and all of the editorial teams and all of that staff, that yes, they gouge us, and yes, the open ed movement probably wouldn't exist without their ridiculous practices, but maybe they provide some value. And so this is an important point. The first thing I'll say is that open textbooks are free to students. They're certainly not free to produce, right? And so whether it's the Hewlett Foundation or government that's providing, funding their development, they're absolutely paid for. The model is different, where authors or groups of authors are paid upfront, a flat fee. There's no royalties. And part of this is also recognizing that very few textbook authors actually get rich off writing textbooks. Unless they write the leading textbooks, nobody's really getting rich off textbooks per se. But also, this is service to discipline. So let's talk about quality though. There have been a number of studies, about 9 actually, that have looked at peer-reviewed studies that have looked at the quality of OER more broadly. And to be fair, OER varies in quality just as much as traditional textbook vary in quality. So there's diversity there. But I want to start with a bit of a comparison group, because I think it's equally fair to ask the question, what is the quality of traditional publishers' resources to start? And so here's a representative sample where you see about 16% of this sample say it's excellent, another 36-ish% say it's good. So if you lump those two together, that's about 50% or just over 50% of the sample that are saying traditional publishers' resources, good or excellent, favorable rating, right? There's also the green portion, 35%, who say, I really don't have an opinion, right? It's all right. So about 65% have an opinion. But if you look at, of the people who have an opinion, how many people think it's good or excellent? That's about 80%. Okay. Now let's look at OER. And the biggest thing you'll see with OER is few people know about it. So the biggest portion is the green bar, where most faculty have never heard of OER. It sounds like, what does this term mean? And so 60% say, I have no idea what you're talking about, my friend. But those who do have an opinion, 25, let's say, and let's say 5 over here. So about 30% of the 40% who have an opinion think it's good or excellent. In other words, that's a 75% approval rating relative to an 80% approval rating. In BC, research that we did over the last year showed that when you compare people who've adopted OER in their classes, compare them with people who have not, obviously those who've adopted OER rate the quality as significantly higher, and that may reflect disciplinary variation in the quality of OER. In some cases, OER are produced by professional bodies that govern a particular discipline, for example. But in other cases, you're just talking about the impact of experience and interacting with these resources. The Open Textbook Library, which is at the University of Minnesota, runs workshops for faculty throughout the United States. And in those workshops, they invite faculty who attend to review an open textbook. If they do so, the institution pays the faculty member an honorarium in support of their review work. And what they find is roughly 40% of faculty who review an open textbook end up adopting an open textbook, which is another revealing factor, insight. But again, these are just broad numbers. This is the faculty perspective. What do students think about OER? There's lots of data, but I'll show you one example that comes from my own classes and that of another instructor, a colleague of Joe's and I as well. And the different bars are just the other instructor and myself. And so, do you like the quality? Yes, they like the quality more broadly. What else do they like about the open resources? The convenience, the portability. These are very similar numbers across these dimensions, so I'm lumping them together. This is an absolute no-brainer. Are you happy with the cost savings? Well, obviously, that's a ridiculous question to ask them, although we had to ask them. We know it's going to be a yes. But there's two other questions that are relevant here. How much do you typically spend? Get a sense of those numbers. And it shouldn't surprise us. On average, about $150 is what we find in almost every survey that we do with students. I should say, though, that I think it's particularly fitting that this graph resembles someone extending their middle finger. Don't you? Just feels right somehow. But then also at the end of the semester, after they've used the open textbooks and they've interacted with them, all right, now at the end of the semester, you use this for 4 months, would you have preferred to pay and have a traditional textbook? It's an important question to ask them at the end. And overwhelmingly, no. It's very, very few. And these are difficult numbers. For students do not typically express their delight and satisfaction with traditional textbooks to this degree. Again, there is a bit of a halo effect with the fact that it's free, and that halo effect shows up in course evaluations where they're still writing about it. But not even course evaluations. There was an online survey we ran in a number of classes throughout BC that had adopted open textbooks. And here are some of the comments that I see in there. What did you like? Some of them talk about the convenience, the immediate access, the portable access, the permanent access. Some of them talk about the cost savings, of course. But this is the one that means a lot to me as an instructor, right? I would not have bought the textbook for this course because it's an elective. I would have possibly walked away with a C. Now I might actually get an A-. And this is a large number of our students, of course. You think about curiosity-based learning and how many of us from day one at university knew which discipline we were going to pursue, what our major was going to be, what our career was going to be, and how many of us fell in love with a particular discipline somewhat by accident. The importance of curiosity-based learning. So let's look at efficacy. And there have been 13 peer-reviewed studies of the impact of open educational resource adoption on educational outcomes, a number of them. Combined aggregated sample of about 65,000 students, and every single one of those 13 studies says exactly the same thing. Different authors, different subjects, different contexts, exactly the same result. In almost every case, there is no difference between in the performance of those who have adopted open textbooks versus those who've been assigned traditional course materials. Where there is a difference, in those few cases where there are differences, the differences favor open textbook students, which is amazing in some sense, but it shouldn't surprise us. I do not mean to suggest that open textbooks have some wonderful angelic quality that somehow allows students to do better. I truly believe it's the issue of access, and it's those who wouldn't have accessed those resources otherwise whose performance is elevating the group mean. That's my belief, anyway. But I'll show you a couple of examples of this, representative examples. One of the best studies I've seen so far in terms of its design is this one, which was published last year. Quasi-experimental, of course, because you can't randomly assign students to these different textbooks within the same class. That will upset the ones who have been asked to shell out $200. But you randomly assign sections. But what they did, at least to ensure some equivalency of groups, is they collected data on about 10 different variables as covariates, and they used propensity score matching to ensure the equivalency of these groups, essentially ensuring that there's no pre-existing differences between these student populations before we look at outcomes. So this is across 10 institutions, 15 courses, 16,000 students, and they found that students who had adopted OER or who had been assigned OER in place of traditional materials were they were most likely in 13 out of the 15 sections. There was no difference in their performance at all. Where there was a difference, those 2 sections favored the open educational resource students. There was no section in which the students with traditional materials had lower withdrawal rates. Right? So a lower withdrawal rate is an important thing. Being able to pass the course with a C- or better, effectively being able to use it as a prerequisite to go further in the discipline, you're more likely to see that happen with the open textbook students, and more likely, in fact, than anything else, to see no difference. There was only one course out of the 15 where the traditional textbook students were more likely to pass the course with a C- or better. Similar picture with higher course grades. Most likely that there's no difference. Where there is a difference, it's 4-to-1 in favor of the open textbooks. And they're also more likely to be enrolled in more courses the present and the next semester, which suggests that some of those cost savings are being channeled, and it is affecting some things like program completion rates. This is not the only study that speaks to those data, though. The other study I'll just splash on the screen right now is one that we just finished as well. This was because there was no efficacy study of open textbooks that had been done in Canada so far, and we were interested in the difference in educational context. And we did much the same thing. We randomly assigned sections. I recruited a bunch of instructors, and we had them take traditional textbook sections, paying whatever they would have normally, about $150, or open textbooks, which were free. But we also wanted to look at the format. So for half of the open textbook students, they received digital, free, with the option to print at home or professionally. And for the other half, we gave them a print copy of the open textbook with the option to download. And we were interested in whether they would sort of reach across formats and how they would navigate that. The short story is that there was almost no difference across all instructors and all exams in the performance of those with different textbooks. The only case where there was a difference was the first exam at the beginning of the semester, or a month in anyway, and that's where the traditional textbook students performed significantly worse than those with the open textbooks. Again, I think this speaks to the issue of access. So anyway, this is being prepared for publication but feel free to ask me questions about this later on. This is the rubric that I want to share with you that I think is useful to apply, though. David Wiley is regarded quite widely as one of the fathers of open education. And it's a bit washed out, but I like this rubric. It's mad, sad, glad, rad. And on the y-axis, you're seeing the cost to students of instructional materials. And it should probably say 400 over here, but anyway, low cost to high cost, or actually no cost down there. And over here, we're looking at the proportion of students who complete the course with a C or better. Now, the sad and glad quadrants are not that interesting because they're not surprising. And what I mean by that is if you don't buy course resources, if you don't spend anything, and you do badly, that's sad, but it's not surprising. If you spend money, buy the resources, and you do well, you're glad in a sense, but it's not surprising. But what they found, this was a study I'm thinking of, took place at Mercy Community College, where they converted an entire math department, half of their sections at that point anyway, from a traditional textbook for math with My Math Lab. It's an online platform for quizzing. About $170. They shifted to an open textbook with an open math testing platform that cost the students about $5. And what they found was that when it was the traditional textbook sections with that high cost, just under 50% of the students passed the course with a C or better. But with the open option, it was about 62%. And that really is the difference between mad and rad in this particular case. But this is a rubric I would encourage you to apply when it comes to this question of how good could it be? Because experience with it changes perceptions, but one answer as well to what is the impact of, what is the quality of a resource is what is its efficacy, what is its impact on educational outcomes. And I suspect, Woven into all of this picture and how we interpret this picture are our own assumptions about all of my students have the course materials. Of course, I listed it in my syllabus, right? The second assumption being all of my students who have the course materials are vigorously, routinely reading the course resources. And those are fanciful ideas that we like to play with, of course. So anyway, at this point, I certainly feel like open textbooks in particular, but OER more broadly, represent a bit of a win-win-win situation. For students, this is a win and it's a no-brainer. In terms of the cost savings, sure. In terms of the access, that's immediate, that's permanent, that's flexible across formats that they have forever. And course performance, which doesn't suffer and perhaps can only improve. But for faculty, this is the exciting bit. Adaptation, updating, revising, remixing, being able to contextualize these resources to suit your pedagogical goals, embedding within your textbook or resources assignments and scaffolding skill development within it, right? I think we all know how textbook adoption works for large multi-section courses. You start with 15 books, all of them really, and then you have a committee, a wonderful committee, and the committee will shortlist 6. And then, you know, once you're done, everyone sort of whines and grinds, and then eventually you end up with the chosen one. And the chosen one is not the one that's clearly the exceptional leader. It's the one that nobody blackballed is the one you end up with, right? This is the one that everyone can live with, is you end up with. Every textbook has imperfections. We think about areas that are weak depending on the expertise of the author, areas where they've overreached a bit, recent developments that you're going to have to wait 3 years for the new edition to incorporate. You can take out stuff, you can add stuff, you can embed your assignments. You can even, imagine this, involve your students in the contextualization of these resources. Imagine course assignments being the revision and contextualization using local examples, local statistics, and so on to illustrate certain phenomena. And then for institutions, of course, there's growing evidence that it impacts enrollment, retention, and even completion rates. And this is where the institutions as a whole stand quite a bit to gain. But even this is just OER. But I should say this, as a recovering textbook addict, I certainly think of myself as one. I don't always assign a textbook, right? I often teach upper level classes. I'm used to putting together readings and other resources for areas that are too niche of a topic to actually have a textbook in the first place. So part of this is questioning my own practice. But when I do assign a textbook, it's no question that I prefer it to be open. But even here, we're just talking about the start of innovation. There are institutions, for example, like Tidewater Community College, which have developed entire programs that they called Textbook Z programs because they have zero textbook costs. There's a 2-year business administration program at Tidewater, for example, and it's not the only institution that's doing this, that's based on zero textbooks. And since they've launched it, they've seen a massive increase in demand for seats in that program. It's benefiting the institution, it's benefiting the community. There is a loser, of course, in all of this, and those are called the publishers. But I want to spend a little bit of time, about 10 minutes or so here at the end, talking not just about OER anymore, but broadening the discussion to talk about open pedagogy. And I want to talk about assessment. This morning, Joe and I had a great discussion with a broader reading group in cognition, in psychology, about assessments and how we usually design and implement assessments, formative, summative. And of course, this is certainly prevalent. I think it's fair to say. Multiple choice testing in particular, it's ubiquitous, of course. And very often, of course, it's the lowest common denominator, which is fact-based, not applied questions derived directly from publisher-supplied test banks. That exists, of course, and there's a reason why that's popular. And you can design really good and powerful multiple choice testing. Multiple choice questions, in fact, that tap the higher echelons of Bloom's taxonomy. This is possible if you do it right. But at the same time, I'm sure you're thinking, well, we do much more than that. We assign lab reports and, you know, research presentations and research essays. We definitely assign research essays. But again, I'm going to suggest that there's interesting ways in which we can play with pedagogy over here that allow it to be open and allow it to be far more meaningful. David Wiley, oddly, refers to the use of traditional assignments as disposable assignments, which is a bit pejorative, I'll admit. But he's talking about the number of hours that a student spends working on an assignment, let's say a research essay. And when I say hours, I'm being optimistic, of course. And they submit it to one person. Only one person's ever going to read their work. And then as an instructor, we painstakingly provide the student with feedback, right? Written, formative feedback. How many of the students in the class pick up those essays that are marked? And of the students who pick up those essays, how many of them are reading the comments as opposed to looking at the grade and moving on? And when you put all of that together, the hours that they spend for one person and the hours that we spend providing feedback, it's almost like it's a tremendous waste of human potential. Or at least it could be aligned in a different way. And this is where we're talking about something different, right? We've all experienced this, I think. It's nothing more annoying than this, having gone through the trouble. But what we're talking about is something that lives beyond the course. So imagine harnessing the students' energy, potential, and even creativity, and having them produce resources for the commons. Having them produce resources that extend and live well beyond the course itself. And this is what might be called a renewable assignment, but that others call the odd term legacy assignment. Right? It's an odd term, I'll admit. But it's about thinking differently about how we approach assessment in the first place, and how much meaning students see in a particular assignment as they're working their way through a course. I'll give you specific examples of this. One of my favorite examples is ChemWiki. This is a major initiative out of the University of California at Davis, where a researcher there, Delmar Larson, received funding to do this. Think about Wikipedia for a moment, and think about how troubling Wikipedia is to many faculty, and how many faculty explicitly forbid students from citing articles in Wikipedia because of perceived unreliability. Now, think about what they're doing over here. Students as course assignments, writing, updating, revising, editing articles, wiki articles related to not just chemistry, but a variety of STEM disciplines. But those articles do not go online. Those are vetted by graduate students. And those articles in turn are vetted by a big faculty board that's international. And it's only after it goes through multiple layers of vetting and revision and faculty approval that it goes live. So it cannot be edited by just anybody. And you have this massive encyclopedic amount of information about all of the STEM disciplines that now live in STEMWiki, and which includes ChemWiki, of course. Dozens of institutions are now using this as their textbook for the course. It's updated as quickly as you need if there's a new breaking development within the field. It's customizable. There are learning analytics that you can draw on when students log in. You're able to see what proportion of our student body in this particular class is accessing the required readings for this exam for the first time 24 hours before the exam, for example. And you can look at course design and reinventing that on the basis of this information. But you can add to it, and for students it's really deeply meaningful work. At this point, amazingly, ChemWiki is the most visited chemistry website in the world, and it's been built by students. It's astonishing, meaningful work. This is open pedagogy. And of course, this happens with Wikipedia as well. In psychology, we have a big organization called the Association for Psychological Science. And for many years now, they've been pioneering this Wikipedia initiative, where there are a lot of psychology articles. They are viewed quite a bit. But only about 2/3 of them have gone through Wikipedia's version of peer assessment, which is not particularly stringent. And even of those, only 9% have good article status, which again speaks to the unreliability of Wikipedia and in fact confirms our fears. But APS decided to try and address the problem instead of whining about it. And so we have, not just in psychology, but in fact in a range of other disciplines, instructors embedding within their courses assignments that involve the updating and revision and improvement of articles related to their particular discipline. It's extremely popular. Right? You think about the learning outcomes that are involved over here, and absolutely you can look at these. Many of these are traditional outcomes, but many of these assignments allow for the development of skills that you wouldn't normally be able to do, or at least not easily implement anyway. When it comes to experiencing or the peer review process, enhancing or helping teach them digital literacy skills. And I mention that because people use this digital natives phrase all the time, and I can't even tell you how much this annoys me, because in practice, I'm far more digitally savvy than many of my students, and I think that's a false assumption in many cases. There's a lot of scaffolding and instruction that's required, and in some cases, this is an opportunity to do that for them. But especially the last one, being able to communicate complex ideas within your discipline for a public audience, for a general audience. And for the majority of our students who do not go on to graduate school in our disciplines, that's a key skill that they're going to be able to take with them. So as I said, students like it, instructors like it. Here are some representative comments from students who've participated. They talk about the value of the information that they're presenting to someone. This is a student in Alberta. Another student in Toronto feels awesome to take information squirreled away behind paywalls and share it with Wikipedia's vast readership. They're talking, of course, about summarizing and interpreting research that is traditionally hidden behind paywalls and providing those summaries on Wikipedia's websites. Some of them talk about being encouraged by more than just the grade, something bigger than themselves, something that lasts, and others say the same thing. And you don't have to read all of this, but I do think that there's something tremendously humbling about the realization that when I publish a journal article in a scholarly journal that's peer-reviewed, there are far, far, far fewer people who will ever read my work than will read an article that my student edited on Wikipedia. That's slightly humbling, but it also offers some hope. So as I said, it is popular. There have been lots of articles in Wikipedia that students have written, lots of instructors that have participated, and almost every instructor, according to Wikipedia's own survey, the Wikipedia Foundation, who've participated in this initiative indicate that they would want to do this again. So it doesn't appear to have been quite as difficult. There's other examples too. In psychology, we have a wonderful project called the NOBA project, a group that provides OER for introductory psychology, and they run an annual video competition where they ask students across the world to produce 2 or 3 minute instructional videos that provide overviews of particular psychological theories or concepts, creative. And they do this. And they, of course, if they win, all of these videos are uploaded online with an open Creative Commons license. They receive recognition, of course, and even a monetary award. Last year, this international award had the first place go to 2 students at Simon Fraser University in BC. The other prizes went to students at Ohio State and in India and Singapore. It's tremendous. But now think about these students, because now instructors across the world are actually using this video as part of their course materials. Instructors are using work built by students. And you think about the amount of pride and investment in this work. They care about it more. They see the meaning of it more. And in some cases, it could be something different as well. Imagine, for example, asking your students. I tried to do this. I copied this assignment, which is an Action Teaching Award winner from a social psychology network, where they suggested getting your students who have this budding expertise in your discipline to share it with the broader community by writing and publishing op-eds, right? Take your knowledge and bring it to bear on a social problem and share it with the community in this fashion. And again, the skill development that's involved in writing and getting an op-ed published, beyond the pride, beyond the fact that this is part of an electronic portfolio of your academic work, is quite tremendous. So really for me, it's not that traditional assessments are necessarily bad. I look at this as, again, additional layers, new options, and something that allows us as instructors, but also students, to unleash a layer of creativity that we wouldn't otherwise be able to do so easily. In many ways, I view assessments as vehicles, as airplanes, if you will, right? Because they have to transport our students from where they are now to where they will go by the end of the term, by the end of the assignment, at least in terms of skill development or otherwise knowledge. But in many ways, I think when I stick to traditional assessments, and particularly if I imagine a course that's based entirely, solely, uniformly on multiple choice testing, it very much feels like taking an airplane and choosing to drive it down the highway. Because you can do that. People are going to look at you funny, but you're really wasting its potential. You're wasting the potential of what the assignment is capable of when it's designed and capable of so much more than simply driving down the highway. So if all of this talk of open educational resources and open pedagogy sounds familiar, it may be because of the pervasiveness of and increasingly popularity of open science practices. This is happening more and more for different reasons. For reasons that have to do with accountability and trying to further the process of science itself. So you have now the drive for researchers to share openly their hypotheses and their research plans before they collect their data, to prevent data fraud and fabrication, for example. And you have professional journals, leading journals, assigning digital badges for researchers who do just that. Then, of course, you design your research, you have your questionnaires, your instruments, and there's a drive to share research materials openly and badges for that, to enable replication efforts and enhance the reproducibility of results within your discipline. Then, of course, you collect your data And there's a drive to share data openly, once again, to guard against malpractice, but also to help science move forward faster. We analyze the data, but now increasingly moving away from proprietary, overpriced platforms like SPSS to platforms like R or JASP, which are now in my field becoming more the standard. Then we look to publish, and there are big mainstream journals that are looking very seriously and piloting open peer review and not double-blind, the names being attached. And then, of course, open access publishing itself, not in predatory journals, but in high-profile journals as well. And we're slowly starting to realize that it is in fact true that articles that are published in the open are in fact much more likely to be cited as well. It's extraordinary why we've allowed for so long the combination of public funding, whether it's from Tri-Council or elsewhere, together with volunteer work provided by peer reviewers as academics, to effectively produce record profits for Elsevier. None of this makes sense, and it's one of these assumptions that we've needed to question for a very long time. So, this is where I'm at. Quite literally. Mac is interesting. I mean, I've had a fascinating day where one of the places I got to visit today really, for me, brought home how innovative this place can be. We were in the live lab earlier, which just blew my mind. If you've never been in there, heavens, it's astonishing, the capabilities of how technology can allow and unleash innovation in research and scholarship, but also in teaching. It's extraordinary. And when I think about open educational practices more broadly, I do think about social justice, absolutely, and I think that's deeply important. But I do think about academic freedom as well, and I think about pedagogical innovation as well. And I think for all of those reasons, I think McMaster in particular, as this movement grows within Ontario and it spreads from the west to the east, there is a bit of a vacuum when it comes to leadership in the east of Canada, at least with these practices. But there's a growing community of interest. And I would hope that whether it's OER or open pedagogy or open science even, that you see some merit and you see some possibilities of where you might expand and engage your curiosity and really allow your students to flourish as well along the way. So, thank you for your attention.